And this is a story that's been published over at Raw Story by Travis Ryder. I'm assuming it's Ryder, Travis Rieder. He's a research scholar at the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins University. And he's basically saying that if you want to have that, because of the climate crisis, because we are looking at mass dislocation of hundreds of millions, billions of people over the next generation, which will almost certainly lead to wars and crises and famines and diseases. And I mean, some serious stuff is coming down the road as a result of the climate crisis, which, you know, is only gently being addressed, particularly in the United States. In fact, in the United States, it's, quote, still controversial, which is such nonsense. But in any case, he's saying that the answer is to have fewer children. He's like, I'm not going to bring, you know, multiple kids into this world. Life is going to be tough. And I understand that. He says a valuable philosophical contribution here is the difference between making people happy and making happy people. He said, when I feed a hungry person or prevent a harm from befalling somebody, I improve a person's well-being. But when I create a person whom I will then feed and prevent from harm, I make a person who will predictably be well off. And in the first case, I add happiness to the world. Whereas in the second case, I added happiness by creating a person who will be happy. See the difference? He gets into this whole philosophy thing and says, I would argue that it is more anti-life to prioritize creating new life over caring for or even not harming those who already exist. Now, one of the arguments that people push back against, you know, bioethicists and whatnot who are saying we should have smaller families rather than large is, you know, you don't want to be in the situation of Japan, you know, where the population is aging and there's fewer people for the workplace. Oh, my God. Well, there's an interesting story this morning about how we can kind of generally, broadly expect that over the next decade, we're going to lose about 5% of our jobs simply because automation is getting so much better. Artificial intelligence, robots, you know, what used to take 10, 15 people to make, you know, on an assembly line is now done with one or two robots. What used to take 15 checkout clerks in a supermarket is now done with one person supervising self-checkout machines. And you know, every day this is, you know, the tellers in banks are being replaced by an app on your phone. You know, increasingly human labor is becoming less important. And so if we're going to have a 5 or 6% decrease in the need for our labor force, do we really want to be growing our population? I think that, you know, an aging and thus shrinking population like Japan has, like Germany has, although Germany's has changed right now because they're taking all these immigrants in from Syria. But, you know, an aging and diminishing population actually drives up the price of labor. It increases the demand for labor, which increases wages, which stimulates the economy from the bottom up, and which produces a positive outcome. In fact, I mean, you know, the best example of this is what happened with the bubonic plague in the 1340s, I think it was, or the 1430s, I forget which, but it was back in the day, right? When a third of the population of Europe died from the Black Plague. What happened? A third of the population, gone. What happened? What happened was the Renaissance. People went from being serfs, from being the property of the owners of the land on which they lived, along with the land. They went from being the property of people to becoming independent men mostly, but work people, workers. And they were able to set their own wages. And in fact, they started forming guilds, what today we would call unions. The Masons came out of that era, at least in a more modern form. And as people were able to charge more for their labor, because there was more demand for labor, because a third of the population was dead, people were able to charge more for their labor. People were able to work fewer hours and have more leisure time. And what did they do with that leisure time? They invented democracy. They invented music. I mean, they didn't invent this stuff, right? But it was like, you know, all this brilliant writing that came out of the Renaissance, the art that came out of the Renaissance, the music that came out of the Renaissance, the cultural transformation that came out of the Renaissance, that all set the stage for the Enlightenment, which was just 4 generations, just 100 years later, you know, coming along again as a consequence of a change in the dynamic between labor and the labor market. It wasn't because a bunch of people died off the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment came about in large part because new lands were being discovered that could be exploited in Africa and in the Americas, and you know, great wealth was being taken back to Europe. You know, I mean, it was you know, the Enlightenment, you could say, was this wonderful thing that helped bring about the United States, but it happened because, you know, the white Europeans were able to rob, rape, and pillage North America, Central America, South America, and Africa. But it came about as a result of a change in those labor markets. So should we have fewer people? Is that an obligation? Is that an ethical thing to have fewer children?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Because of climate change. Because specifically we're facing an existential crisis right now. Is this a Malthusian moment?